to another episode of the Talent Lab. I'm taking the reins on this one, but Brad is right here with me. So say hello, Brad.
Hello, Brad.
That is typically his line. So one of the most frequent requests we get as recruiters is for candidates reaching out to us, asking for us to review their resumes to get them ready for the job market. And Brett has already done a great, extensive episode on what a resume build, a proper resume build should look like, which is called Keystone Resume. And it's really the ideal, comprehensive way to build out the foundation of your professional story. And we'll include the link to that episode in the show notes. Now, today, by popular demand, we're going to do something that is a much quicker, a slightly different angle, and a much shorter format, hopefully. If Brad's Keystone Resume is more like a rebuild or, a full teardown and a new construction, this episode is really not architectural planning. This is Resume Rehab, a very practical refresh for people who need to get their resume out on the job market as soon as they can, instead of turning the resume rebuilding into a very long, drawn out project. So, because the reality is most people really don't have a lot of time to fully reconstruct their resume every time they want to apply to a new role. So today we're going to go section by section, provide very practical, quick tips, focusing on what matters most, what really doesn't, and what quick adjustments you can make to get your resume ready to be out there in the talent market. And really for it to make a real difference. Now, while Brad and I typically work in life sciences space, these tips and everything we're going to talk about today applies across industries, across functions, across all levels. And I do want to emphasize that in the ideal world, you're going to do the work. And I want you to do the work. I want you to listen to Brad's Keystone approach, build your resume from the ground up, and really do it the right way. But so before we jump into the rehab version, Brad, I'd love for you to walk us through what the Keystone Resume concept is, just so the listeners can actually familiarize themselves with it, and then go listen to your full episode. But give us a brief version of what it is and what it's for.
Right. Thanks, Marina. So the Keystone approach is designed for when you have a job, you are successfully happy and challenged. It's for preparing for the future to be ready for when that right opportunity comes along, where you can custom tailor your experience to focus on the business problem that the role solves. It's a little different. It takes a level of planning and a level of dedication and becomes more powerful the longer you use it. And it can also be helpful for applying to internal roles and or using your conversation with your one-up during your yearly review to showcase your value, projects, growth contributions. When you need to hone in and get very granular on your accomplishments, this is the tool or system to use. And it can be used when you're looking for a job, but you're trying to remember all the details of your experience and the projects over a considerable period of time. So it's designed to be a very long form. You can cut into multiple hyper-targeted shorter form versions. So I would not say there's ever a bad time to start employing these tactics, but it absolutely can seem overwhelming to take it on if you're in reaction mode and looking for a job. So the Keystone system is more strategic, but what can we do when we need a more tactical deliverable?
Yeah, and that's exactly why we wanted to put this conversation together. Keystone is the ideal long-term strategy, but in this episode, we're still going to give you the shorter version, how to make your resume more effective right now without taking too much time to do so. Again, as I mentioned, like a fresh coat of paint or whatever other DIY metaphor you want to come up with. We're going to start with the first section, name and address. We're starting at the very top. This is one of those sections that seems pretty straightforward, but can actually work against you if it's not handled thoughtfully. Obviously, your name, your phone number, and email should be there. But I would also recommend putting in your LinkedIn profile because most resumes are shared digitally. So this allows whoever it is that's reviewing your resume to either add it to their system or just click and look through. As for your address, I always say city, state, zip. You do not need your full street address. Nobody really needs to know where you live, what street you live on, what's your house number. City, state, zip is more than enough. But what I've seen a lot, especially lately, is that people put in city and state, but skip the zip code. I feel that it is a potential error on your part. And the reason why is because when the resume gets parsed into the applicant tracking system, Those are very recognizable fields, the city, the state, and the zip. But when the applicant tracking system is being searched by the recruiters, or if the resume list or the candidates list is being sorted, it's often done by the zip code radius. And if your zip code was not on your resume, then there is nothing for the system to grab onto to put you in a specific location. So that can kind of work against you as you're hovering in Neverland at that point. Where it becomes even more important, and I think this is an often overlooked point, is if you're planning on changing your location and applying to roles only in a very specific area. Obviously, it doesn't matter if you're looking for a remote position, but let's say you are in, like me, Clarkston, Michigan, 48346, but you have a definitive date when you're planning on relocating to Houston, Texas 7700, only applying to jobs in Texas, and you no longer want to be considered for jobs in Michigan, should have a Texas address. If you don't have the address yet, you could just put in the general middle of the area point, and you don't have to pretend that you are in Texas already. You can be completely honest, as you should be, and say something along the lines of relocating to Houston, Texas, and then zip code. What it allows it to do, you are essentially telling the human observer, the HR person, the talent acquisition person, look at your resume. They will know what jobs you're looking for and what your future location will be. And if you do have a definitive move date, definitely put it in there. But it also allows you to capture the attention and the proper placement by the computer system, who will put you in the right city, state, zip code to be reviewed for a particular opening that is close to that city, state, zip code. So again, if you are applying to remote roles, it may not be that relevant. But if you're planning on relocating somewhere, then just obviously add the new location as your future city, state, zip. Brad, any additional thoughts on that?
I do. In the overall job interview process, you will need to at some point share your city and state. I think it's fine to lead with that. I would be hesitant to put my full street address, but I can be a little overcautious. I don't even have my real or same birth date on any of my social media accounts. And yes, I'm proud of my tinfoil hat. But if you're open to relocation to specific areas, that is something that can be addressed in the dreaded cover letter as well. It may go without saying, but if you do not have any intention of relocating to a specific geography that the role is in, don't apply. There may be work from home days in a role, but that typically means you are still within a commutable distance.
Yeah. Right. And ultimately, as those of you who have worked with me know, I say frequently, the resume is designed to elicit a conversation. So, what we want you to do is to remove the reasons for the hiring manager to not have that conversation, or to really pass on your resume before the conversation even starts. All right, next section, name, address. After that, we typically see some kind of objective. We are seeing it less and less frequently, but I still see them from time to time on the resume. And I think most of them stay on the resume out of habit. The format that's just kind of been accepted for many, many years. And in most cases, you really don't need it. The objective is for you to get a job in your field that you're qualified for. Pure and simple. That is why you are applying to the job. You don't need to state it overtly. And your experience and your skills should speak to that. Now, there are a few exceptions to that rule. When you are switching careers, when you are a fresh grad without a lot of practical hands-on experience, then the objective section does allow you to help the reader, whoever it is that's evaluating your skills, understand why you are applying to that job. And I think that's probably the only reason I can think of using the objective. Normally, I would recommend just not having it. What about you, Brett? What do you think? Got it?
Yeah,
Replace it?
I am sorry, but cut it out. I agree with you
The heck with it.
that the objective is to get a job in your field. If
Okay.
you really want to be esoteric and talk about your goal to improve human health outcomes based on something that has impacted your life, i.e., why do you want to work within a specific modality, then maybe 50-50 on that, depending on the person and the situation. But 9 times out of 10, I'd say cut it out. You're wasting valuable real estate. The person that is looking at your resume is seeing how you have solved their business problem in the past. You need to be able to demonstrate that quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And after the objective section, we see another section that is equally as controversial, depending on how you look at it. It's the summary section. In my mind, it's a little bit more of a mindset shift when we're talking about how to spruce it up properly. A resume is not a biography. It's not meant to capture everything you are, everything you've ever done. It's a calling card that allows you to have a conversation as the next step in the
Hmm.
process. And really the
Hmm.
same should go for the summary section. Your summary section, first of all, does not need to be labeled. Some people understand that when you're putting a few paragraphs or words or whatever after your name and address, it is typically to summarize what is to come. And it kind of leads to it naturally, right? Think of it as your elevator pitch. This is what you do, where your strength is, and what value you bring to the table as relevant to that job. And I think this is the key. It needs to be relevant to the jobs you are targeting. You might have an incredible, very interesting life, very interesting background, but if it doesn't align to what you're applying for, it really doesn't belong at the very top. Another quick note here, at least maybe that's my personal opinion, avoid the fluff. Statements like punctual, detail oriented, hardworking, they really don't add much value because that's just your opinion of yourself, because they're really not backed by anything concrete at that point.
Right.
So focus on functionality, experience, and outcomes. As you've said before, Brad, the goal is not really to get the job from the resume, it's to get to the next step. So that should be the thinking. So read your summary, ask yourself, is it clear? Is it relevant? Does it make someone want to keep on reading your resume to find out more? Is there anything else? Where do you think people go off track here, Brad?
I think if you cannot speak or say your summary in about 3 breaths, then you're going too long. Read it out loud, make it concise. And, I like the word that you used, relevant. And your goal is to show that you are the most relevant candidate. And your experience and work product are relevant and relatable to the business problem that this solves. Saves generates revenue, or creates or protects process or project continuity. So the summary section absolutely can be a double-edged sword. If prepared properly for the right audience, it can be impactful. If it's not relevant, it's eating up real estate and time for your resume to stand out. And if you've hit certain milestones in your career, so let's just say 10 plus years within something specific, toxicology, regulatory affairs, team leadership, I wouldn't say then it can be beneficial to add that as part of a summary statement. If there has been an arc to your career that you have planned or fallen into and wish to continue that arc, it could be worth mentioning. But whatever you're summarizing, you should be able to back up within your resume bullet points. And your summary should really not be longer than 3, 4 sentences, 3, 4 breaths. If someone needs to summarize your summary, it is not a summary.
Yeah, exactly. Just one more point I wanted to make as you were talking. I was thinking, we're not going to discuss the controversial subject of cover letters, but essentially, your summary is like the abridged, very quick version of a cover letter that makes the person want to read the rest of your resume. So, which would move us to experience, right? The experience section of the resume, experience and bullet points in it. It's really the core of what your resume is, right? This is what people typically skim through very quickly from the summary and get to the meat of the matter. Who you are, what is it that you're doing, and for whom. One of the biggest mistakes that I see is assuming that whoever is reading it, whether it's the talent acquisition person or the hiring manager, that they somehow can read between the lines. No one can. Nobody's going to interpret what you're saying. They're literally just reading the words. So if something is relevant, it needs to be clearly stated. That means that you need to use the language that aligns with the roles that you're targeting. You need to make your key experience easy to spot. You need to not assume that anything will be inferred. Again, as I said, nobody's reading between the lines, they're reading the actual lines. So the practical way to approach this is look at the roles that you are applying for or applying to and identify some common themes. have you done something similar? That's what you're asking yourself, right? And if the answer is yes, then that's what needs to be reflected in your experience. You don't need to hesitate to use relevant terminology. Just use very similar words that you find in those jobs that you're applying to. Reword it, paraphrase appropriately as it applies to your experience. But that is what you need to do as far as the bullets in your experience are concerned. Brett, from your perspective, how do you help people align their experience with what the market is actually asking for without it feeling kind of forced or maybe too structured?
So, while we want to make sure that we're not making assumptions, there is a counterpoint to that where make sure that your summary section, that your bullet points of what you're talking about are not just a regurgitation of your job description. If you are applying for a more senior version or a similar version of roles that you've held before, it should be relatively common knowledge as far as what you were doing. Now, that's where maybe more of the Keystone resume portion comes in to show your accomplishments within that. So, assuming that they know something about the role that you have held before, but it's like I say, it's a bit of a balance there, but just make sure that it's not your, regurgitation of your job description. And, I agree with you. The one thing that I see that candidates assume that whoever is reading their resume understands the focus of all the companies on their resume. So, as you're naming the company, it can be helpful to categorize it. So, preclinical contract research organization, life science tools company, oncology startup focusing on XYZ. Just because the name was clever or sat there doesn't mean that it relates to somebody else. And also be aware that not all titles mean the same thing from company to company. And the same role can be called 3 to 4 different titles. So, scientist 3, senior study director, and associate director can all be referencing the same scope of responsibilities within different size organizations. And one of the themes that I will keep coming back to is that your resume bullet points need to show relevant experience and show how in that role you saved or generated time, saved or generated money, and created, improved, or protected process. And the best way to do that is with metrics where possible, and at the very least, feature benefit statements. But I'm going to come back to that in a little bit.
Great. So don't make assumptions about the reader's ability to read between the lines. Be precise, maybe offer a little bit more detail on the company or the type of role, especially if you're working for a larger company. For example, if you are a clinical operations manager, what kind of clinical trials have you managed? Were they phase one, phase two? Were they phase three? Were they global? Were they not? Those are the details that matter because those are the details that are relevant. And that kind of brings us to structure and length. Again, this is a quick resume rehab, right? So we want to give you some practical knowledge and practical guidance. And there are a few structural points that can make a noticeable difference. So recent experience, for example, should carry more weight than older experience. That means add more detail, more bullet points for what you have done in your current or last position within the last 10 years versus having 20 bullet points for a role that you had right out of college 20 some years ago. That imbalance really does not read well on the resume. Also, speaking of going back 20 some years, in most cases, in my experience, that is really not experience that's considered to be relevant to 20 some years ago. So I sometimes recommend to not include it besides just one line of what was your title at whatever company 20 some years ago. And really, you don't need even bullet points for some of that if the rest of your resume of the last 20 years have been explained diligently, relevantly, and are included on your resume. Because at a certain point, explaining what you have done in detail, what was your functionality 25 years ago, just adds length and really not value. Which brings me to the question of overall length. And my thoughts on that are I don't really think it matters for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's no strict rule. Every recruiter you speak with will give you a slightly different opinion as to what the resume length should be. And of course, it will vary from function to function, from industry to industry. But certain things do stay the same regardless. One, most of the resumes are scanned in by computer and a human these days. Computer doesn't care how long your resume is. For all intents and purposes, it can be 20 pages long. It takes just the same. A human being, no matter the length of the resume, will always concentrate on the first 2 or 3 pages. Probably three is generous, like on the first page and the second page of the resume. So while your resume may be 15 pages long, I would bet in most cases, the human being looking through your resume is reading the first 2 pages and maybe skimming through the rest. So what matters the most is that the top section of your resume, the page 1 and 2, carries the most relevant information about who you are. It is the clearest, it is the easiest to scan because that is what most
Mhm.
people will focus on first. Keeping that in mind, like Brad, what's your opinion? How do you usually guide people on how far back to go, how long the resume should be? Give us your thoughts.
Sure. So when I talk with candidates, I try to get them to focus on the first two-thirds of the first page. So I need to have a good understanding of what you've been doing in the last 2 to 3 years at a minimum. You need to give the reader a reason to continue reading your resume, whether that is to follow a progression or look at us for a specific technology or maybe regulatory jargon. So, depending on the search, when a hiring manager looks at your resume, they want to see where you are now, then follow a logical storyboard of how you got there. And if you've been promoted multiple times within an organization, show that within the timeline. If you have extensive publications, highlighting 5 notable ones, then adding a hyperlink to your publications can be helpful. And what you did 10 years ago is not as important as to what you can do for me now as what you did in the last 5 years. And if your previous experience is relevant to this particular role, then include it. And yes, if there were several experiences 10 to 15 years ago, like Marina said, it might be best just to list them as bullet points together. And also, once you're in an industry position, the positions you held in graduate school or your doctoral degree are not as important. It can be helpful to outline the relevant specifics of, let's say, a postdoc position, maybe if it was within the last 7 years. So one last thought is avoiding what I like to call the Bible text, which is large condensed blocks of text that are uncomfortable on the eye to read. And you're going to lose somebody if you don't give their eyes a bit of a break with some white space.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really not aesthetic, it's scientific. It's as simple as that. Which kind of gets us to metrics and value. I know we've mentioned that word several times already. And again, preaching to the choir, but one area of Brett's Keystone approach really applies, even in a shorter version, is impact. Your resume should show how you save time or reduced cost or improve the process, right? That is something that is quantifiable, especially if you can quantify it, because that's even better. If not, clearly explaining your impact, maybe in terms of deliverables, maybe in terms of overcoming some kind of obstacle, still adds a lot of value. So less fluff, more impact. Brett, how do you think about metrics, describing outcomes? What is that in your mind?
You know what? I think they play well together.
Okay.
So numbers tell a story faster than words can in relation to impact. One of the things that we should also quickly touch on is features and benefit statements. So you can tell me what you did, but I want to know about the impact on the business, process, or team. So a feature is what something is, and a benefit is what something does. So let me give you an example. So a feature is real-time GPS navigation system. That's great, but why do I care? Following up with a benefit is it is a real-time GPS navigation system that gets you to your destination faster and avoids traffic delays, putting you in control of your day. So now apply that principle to describing impact. And that's what the reader of your resume wants to know is how your relevant experience was impactful and how they can extrapolate that impact to solve their current business problem. And a metric rapidly describes something in relation to a change in status quo. And an impact statement can describe in more detail what that change was.
Yeah. I really love that whole GPS comparison. I'm gonna think it over and how I can reword some sections of in my LinkedIn profile to follow that method. Now, let's move on to talking a little bit about something that I've seen more and more is keywords, and obviously something that's relevant to our current talent market and job market, which is AI. So at a basic level, a lot of employers now have applicant tracking systems or ATS systems that have built in capabilities to scan the resumes for keywords, right? This is the similar logic that recruiters have used for years, putting together some kind of Boolean search that's relevant to the job they're trying to fill to scan the resumes for the existence of those keywords. If I'm looking for a teacher, chances are I'm going to have the word teacher in my search. If I'm looking for, let's say, a medical affairs director for an oncology biotech, oncology is going to be the word that I'm going to use in my search, in addition to potential variations of the title, et cetera, et cetera. So, logically, we all know that it helps to reflect the language used in the roles that you're applying for in your resume. We all know this. But that also doesn't mean overloading your resume. It does mean being intentional where you're putting those keywords. I have seen lately some people even include a keyword section at the bottom of their resume to kind of help AI recognize some of those words. Maybe they've worked in a multitude of therapeutic areas and they didn't mention them throughout their resume, but just put them in one section somewhere, therapeutic areas, and just listed them all. Whatever it may be, it's something that does help from the system standpoint, if you will. But at the same time, it kind of may look a little cumbersome on the resume. So, from that perspective, Brett, how do you think about optimizing keywords on the resume for applicant tracking systems for AI without overcomplicating things or making them look kind of ugly?
No, I think the keywords are important, but also with the ATS, CRM, parsing, whatever situation,
Hmm.
having complex tables on your resume may look cute or, a unique design. But if part of your job is not making things look cute or unique design,
Yeah,
stick to a simpler template. Too many boxes confuse the coding and your resume cannot be properly scanned.
that's right.
You really took the time to be selective and put those words in the document. Don't lose them to formatting. And I would say appropriate keywords are important, but keyword stuffing can look awkward and especially out of place without context. I've seen almost a jumble or a word cloud, and it was relatively off-putting. And so if you're going to, put in a, variety of keywords, I would say, yes, agreed. Keep it towards the end of your resume so you're not stealing valuable real estate. And that's assuming that they're getting down to the bottom of your resume.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, ideally, your keywords are actually spruced throughout your resume in the sections where they're relevant to. Another quick note on just AI and how resumes are scanned. A lot of times, when you have those tables or you have images within your resume that may contain those keywords, but it's just an image that you created with whatever those words are, it is not scanned through properly. The system cannot scan an image and assume, at least most systems cannot scan an image and assume words within it. So they don't even read those keywords that could be incredibly relevant to who you are, which is why you've highlighted them by putting them in a pretty little image on your resume. So sometimes simpler is better when it comes to that. And just keep that in mind as you're putting together your resumes. Unless you are in a creative field, maybe keeping it a little bit simpler so you can send it through the system so we can read through it versus visually appreciate the beautiful piece of like calling card that you have made for yourself. Sometimes it's not as effective. And you're right, we're getting to the bottom of the resume. Let's talk about things like education, publications, and additional information sections that tend to live at the bottom of the resume. Now, another controversy, I suppose. If you have 5 or more years of professional experience, in my opinion, your education should typically come after your experience. In most cases, your professional track record carries more weight than where you studied, or actually what you studied. There's, of course, an exception. Like if you're an MD, PhD, we work with a lot of those in the life sciences, or if you have another advanced degree that's directly relevant to what you do, what you can do is you can include that MD, PhD abbreviations right after your name, and that will allow the reader of the resume, whoever is just looking at your resume first, they will assume you have the education that's required to the role, right? Because a lot of those roles do require an MD or PhD that you're applying to. So that is instantly addressed, and then they can concentrate on the experience that you have had in addition to that requirement without overemphasizing what institution you got the degree from, whether it could be positive or negative, right? So let's keep in mind that most people will not read through a long list in detail. And with that in mind, when it comes to publications, same logic applies. Your publications, presentations, speaking engagements, they can all be absolutely relevant to who you are and what you do in the role that you're applying to. But a lot of times they're just scanned through. So maybe list some of the key ones, like Brad mentioned earlier, provide a link to them, to like publications that sit somewhere else. But again, just be aware of the fact that that is something that is going to be just skimmed through by most hiring managers without paying too much attention to it. And so it should live at the bottom of the resume, because by that time, chances are they have already made up their mind if they want to talk to you or not. And then there's the additional information section. I think this is something that people don't talk about a lot. I think this is where you can include a bit of personality, things like hobbies or interests. Will it make an impact? Maybe. But within the reason, it can also be positive. If you're hiring, we're all hiring people, right? Like a person is hiring a person, not just reviewing a document. Use good judgment. Avoid anything that could be seen as controversial or unprofessional or inappropriate. Don't include your politics, do include your volunteering. Kind of like just, kind of like walk that line. Brett, how do you usually think about this section?
Yeah, so I guess it really depends on the position.
Hmm.
It's hard to have a one size fits all for that, and that's a bit of what I was struggling. So yeah, it definitely applies on the role that the candidate's applying for. So if an advanced degree is expected in the role, that should be covered early in the beginning of the resume. Where it gets tricky is the roles where companies are looking for either a BS with 10 years of experience,
Hmm.
or an MS with 5 years of experience, or a PhD with 2 years of experience. All those lovely blends there. And in some cases, the degree relates. So there's cases where a role is looking for an immunologist and your degree was in chemistry, but from your career journey gave you the appropriate experience. So if that is the case, highlight it. Remember, don't expect someone else to connect the dots if they don't have time. And regarding publications, it depends on the role, the company, and the seniority. If you're going for a role as a deep scientific subject matter expert and your publications that show that expertise, then by all means put them down. But if you have 40 publications, however, putting in a link to your publications can be more helpful. After 5 to 10, people are going to stop reading. And you also have to remember that there is a difference between your resume and your CV. And your resume is going to be more industry focused and your CV is going to be more publication focused. So it depends on how you want to position it. Now, if you're going for a role in academia, publications are incredibly important, and along with grant funding, and those are critical to have on an academic CV. So just remember, when it comes to publications, what is your focus? Is it your resume or is it your CV?
Again, how your experience and education and additional information is relevant to the role that you're applying for. We're just going to keep stressing that word. Let's move on to something that's a little bit more tangential to the resume, a LinkedIn profile, and just in general kind of sense of consistency. It's really important. Your resume and your LinkedIn profile, if you have one, and you should have one, they should align. If you're actively looking for a job and your LinkedIn profile is outdated, it can create a little bit of confusion. Updating it doesn't cost anything. Aligning it with your resume, it doesn't cost anything. It's just a little bit of effort. And it's often one of the first places people look at when they get your resume and they kind of search you up on LinkedIn. So when you're applying to roles, especially if you're genuinely interested in them, it can also help you connect people to people within that company. So networking obviously doesn't guarantee anything, but it's a recommendation that I always tell every single candidate that I'm working with, especially those at a higher executive and leadership level. Look at the company LinkedIn page, go to the people tab, connect with people that are kind of relevant, or again, people who may be at the level that you're applying to. Just connect with people to expand your network. Again, doesn't really hurt you. It does increase your visibility. Just to make sure that you do that after you spruce up your LinkedIn profile, and that your LinkedIn profile reflects your current positioning before reaching out.
Excellent point. Excellent. No,
Do the work first.
no, excellent point. Excellent point. So, yeah, I think it's great when your LinkedIn profile and your resume align. And it's incredibly helpful as a validation tool. But I also understand that most people do not update their profile regularly. So if you're actively searching for a role, I would say spend the time aligning them if you want your experience to stand out. And if I can get your LinkedIn profile if I'm searching for a person. If it's just your experience, that's the only, if you are actively searching for a role, I'd say spend the time aligning them if you want your experience to stand out. I can get to your LinkedIn profile if I'm searching for a person. If your experience is only on your resume or CV, we need to be connected through an application or through an email, which limits your options for passive outreach. So your LinkedIn page is your marketing material. And if your experiences you choose to outline on your profile don't align with the goals you're interested in, that's going to decrease your chances of people reaching out to you for roles that you haven't applied for. And
Absolutely.
if I was forced to break it down, absolutely forced, put up against the wall, I would say your LinkedIn should show your responsibilities and your resume or CV should show your accomplishments, but it is absolutely best if they're aligned.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, a lot of the candidates that we're working with, especially in this market, are applying through LinkedIn. And if you are applying to jobs through LinkedIn, your LinkedIn should be up to date. It's just pure and simple. One last point, and obviously, this is something that Brett and I are both very passionate about. If you're working with a recruiter or a talent advisor, and while there are many of us, it's really worth taking, I guess, our input with maybe a little grain of salt, but somewhat seriously. We have been working in this industry or in this field for a while. And honestly, if you have a good recruiter that you've been working with, this is what most of my candidates tell us, that a good recruiter will often have insight into either the company or into the hiring manager. So when you are working with a recruiter who is representing you for a specific role, their advice as to how to structure your resume, while may sound cumbersome, but I would absolutely recommend heeding to it, because we know what the hiring manager or the talent acquisition person at the company that we're sending your resume to will like to see on their resume. And we are trying to. So, from that perspective, if a recruiter suggests some kind of adjustments, knowing full well that those are the adjustments that will give you higher chance of getting your foot into the door to have a conversation, it is usually coming from that place and in that context. So I know that, Brett, you've probably seen a candidate or two or more push back on, well, do I have to adjust my resume yet again for every job? So what do you think helps the candidates actually just kind of lean into that advice?
So, where I see challenges is individuals who do not want to put in the effort we suggest, and whether that's yes, tweaks to a resume, putting together a targeted cover letter for experience not on the resume, and full interview preparation. And I see people frustrated at times who do fully prepare, then their first round interview just is a check in the
Yeah.
box interview. And so I understand that frustration, but you're preparing for the entire process. And the preparation translates from company to company giving you more conversational fluency in the market. So, and I'd rather be prepared with something I don't need rather than need something that I'm not prepared for. And last bit here, I find that very few people will actually study and review their own resume before an interview. And remember, that is the document that all too many times hiring managers are reading on the interview, but that's a topic for another episode.
Yeah, definitely. So let's bring it all together. Keystone Resume is the ideal long term system. Look for the link to it in the show notes. What we've talked about today is the practical version, Resume Rehab, a nice way to make your resume clearer, more relevant, more relevant, more relevant, and more effective without starting from scratch. So, if you're at the point where you do want a full rebuild, whether it's a complete overhaul or starting fresh, feel free to reach out, listen to Brad's episode on Keystone Resume, kind of just build that from the ground up. We're also happy to help or point you in the right direction of someone who understands not just resume writing, but how hiring decisions are actually made. And then finally, if you're on the market right now, we understand how challenging it can feel. We have those conversations with candidates, multiple candidates on a weekly basis, applying to multiple roles, not hearing back from the companies. We hear you. We're just as frustrated for you. It's competitive, it's unpredictable. Sometimes it's gut wrenching, and it's very, very, very frustrating. So take a deep breath, take it step by step, pour yourself another cup of coffee, and start with something manageable, like a quick resume rehab with, some of the guidance from us, and just go from there. So thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll see you on another episode of the Talent Lab very soon.